What has happened to the Catholic Church that we don't have the vocations that we had when you were of that age?
First of all, I think we're more critical now. They were, if I knew the answer, then I would probably go to the Vatican to advise them.
There is an opening.
There is an opening, yeah, that's right.
You get your red shoes.
That's right, oh yeah. But I think I'd pass, I'm not sure that I'd use red shoes, but anyway. The problem, I think, right now is we're a little bit more demanding. The church is taking an awfully long time to adapt, and we're making some absolutely serious mistakes. I personally think, for example, that one of the factors that we have such a difficulty in getting priests is that now, if we're not willing to change the format, you know, for example, either having married priests or to have a women priest, I think eventually it'll be very, very difficult to find enough. And we're a sacramental church. So if we don't have the clergy available for the sacraments, the church is actually having a difficult time. And so we're adapting much, much too slowly. And there are still too many central decisions taken rather than allowing a small community to build itself and to take some decisions that are a little different from what would be the norm. And so we're going to really have, I was very happy that Benedict resigned, not because he's, you know, we may not even get it to anyone better, but at least there's a possibility of change. And there's a possibility that they might discuss change and they would not otherwise, you know, because as long as he's there, he's been following in the tradition of John Paul. I don't think he could it's too late for him to change. At 85, you don't change. But they may have somebody a little younger, starting new. It's up to that person then to say, well, this is what I think should be done, and move on. And hopefully the person is going to be open enough to the Spirit so that some changes could be made. But we don't know. We might have someone even weaker but probably not. I think, you know, they're so aware of the problems that they really would be looking for a fixer, I believe.
Do you think the hierarchy of the church is isolated? I mean,
too much.
Brother, you've been, you know, in the front lines of education, Catholic education. The structure of the church seems very far removed from everyday life of Catholics.
And then not enough dialogue. You know, there's a few cardinals that do dialogue and some bishops that dialogue, but most of them think it's a hierarchical. So the top person takes the decisions, and very often not even consulting. So that obviously makes it very difficult to...
A little bit of arrogance in the church.
A lot.
Social dogma of the church is big to me. I mean, you know that the church has meant a lot to me, although I'm not a very religious person in that sense institutionally anymore. How do you deal with that, brother? How do you deal with the conflicts that I'm sure you must have with the prejudice within the church and the prejudice, what you taught me and what you've spent your life doing, and that is being fair and equality and diversity. And yet the Catholic Church is so stuck in the mud in the way they treat women, the whole aspect of how they look at gays in society. It's almost, some Catholics use the church as an institution of hatred. I know that's a strong word, but I feel that sometimes. How do you deal with it?
First of all, the period I had real difficulty with the church was probably when I was between 35 and 45, but more so 35 to 40. And at that time, there were so many contradictions that I really was thinking, I didn't want to leave the brothers, but I was even thinking, how could I get out of the church? You know, so in some way, there were so many contradictions that I said, I really don't know. I wish I could be a Baptist, or I wish I could be something that, you know, I don't feel comfortable now. There were too many contradictions. And one of the reasons that I went back to school and into theology rather than the history or English or any other field that I could have taken was simply to try to spend one full year with serious people on the question of evil and struggling, and how do we handle the church, and how do we find an answer to everything, all the contradictions that are in the gospel or in the Hebrew Testament. So, but at that time, I was able to come to a point where I felt comfortable about my own beliefs, that if I didn't believe it, I didn't believe it, okay? So in other words, when I think, for example, that women should be ordained. I also think that married priests should be ordained. So first of all, in the first centuries of the church, there were some deacons, which actually were the equivalent of our priests, and they were women. Until the year 1000, the priests were all married. So why wouldn't they be married now? They were married for 1,000. So there were a lot of contradictions. So I still say what I believe. I believe that they should be ordained. But at the same time, I live my own life. I'm not going to, it's up to each individual to decide for himself or herself. You know, we have our own conscience, and I find myself educated enough to trust my own self. And so if I believe it, I believe it. If I don't believe it, but I don't allow it to change my behavior. In other words, I think the Catholic religion has marvelous doctrines. You know, the social responsibilities that we have in the church are probably better than almost any other institution. And I also believe that if you look at the gospel of Jesus, simply the gospel itself, the Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek, give everything you have for others, forgive, you know, anything that is, any offense that is given to you. If you just take the positive and live by the positive, then that's fine. You know, so I don't allow what annoys me to really change my behavior. I know I know eventually, in maybe another couple hundred years, some of those doctrines will be changed. I know enough, for example, that my PhD was with a Frenchman by Félicité de Lamennais, and in the year 1833 to 1835, he had serious fights with the church. Why? Because he says every human being should have freedom of speech. Every human being should have freedom of association. Every human being should have freedom of conscience. Every human being should have freedom of religion. Every human being should have freedom of education. So you had a whole series of, and the church, what? Freedom of conscience? Are you crazy? Freedom of speech? If somebody wants to tell lies, is that okay? He's got freedom of speech. He doesn't have freedom of speech. So there were conflicts, serious conflicts. And so he said the church is wrong. He was condemned, and he walked out of the church. Now, I give that example. That was in 1833 to 1836. Those were the crucial years. Well, Vatican II, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of so all the freedoms that were contradicted in 33, 34, 35, 36, and the man simply said, I'm right, I'm walking out of the church. Well, he walked out of the church, but he was right. So it took about 150 years for the church to realize that it had made a serious mistake, and they corrected it. So I hope that, you know, I'd say about 150 years after we die, there'll be some other corrections. And hopefully before too long, maybe the new Pope might even make some corrections. We don't know. There might be some surprises, which I would hope.
Well, for the church to survive, it seems to me that they'll be forced into changes unless they're going to go to the third world countries and sort of redo what they did in America 150 years ago.
Yeah. Well, see, that's a little bit what's happening now. See, the third world country, Africa now is becoming strongly Catholic, so is South America. You know, although South America now has moved off a little bit. But what's happening is that, unfortunately, the more people are sophisticated, the more they realize that there are some serious mistakes. So the more ignorant you are in some way, the easier it is to believe. But the more you're sophisticated and the more you're reading and the more you're seeing what's happening, then the more critical you become. But you don't want to become so critical that it becomes negative on others. You know, you don't want to be a weight on anybody.
So Brother Francis likes to change things from within.
Yeah, basically, because I feel comfortable. What I'm living right now, I feel comfortable. In other words, yes, I try to go to the liturgy, for example, every day. I find great meaning in it. So I go every day, you know. And then we meet in the afternoon for about a half hour of prayer. That's fine. We recite Vespers together. In the morning we recite Lauds together. That's fine. I'm comfortable with that. That's very meaningful for me. So, and then there's nothing that I'm doing that would be considered illegal or...
Tell me about Islam and the movement of Islam in today's world. Is that a threat to the institutional church?
Well, I think it's a threat only if the church doesn't do anything about it. You know, in the sense, I have a difficulty being proselytizing, you know, to talk and try to convince people to join a religion. But it would seem to me that the way we live should attract some people. And if right now Islam is more attractive and more meaningful and gives more value and gives more support to someone than the Catholic faith, then I understand that. In other words, if their religion is more comforting and in some way doing more good than our Catholic faith, then it's up to us, you know, to change and to do something about it. So I really wouldn't make great effort to, you know, to convince people to stay or not to stay. If you see the way we live and you think that's a good way for you to live, fine. But if not, then it's up to you to decide. I look at my own family, my nephews and nieces. I've basically, I'd say out of 9, there's at least 5 that have walked out of the faith, you know, at least 5. I have some of my own brothers and sisters that don't practice their faith anymore. You know, they simply say, it's not an honest expression for me, and I'm not following it.
And when you consider that, you say, no, I'm going to stick with it because someday, if I stay and others like me stay, it'll change.
Yeah, but also, and not only because I want them to change, but because for me, it is meaningful. It is comforting, and it is meaningful. And I've enjoyed my life. I was in a situation where I could be helpful, and basically, most of the time, I was according to my beliefs and most of the time, I simply followed my conscience, and there was never, in fact, I would say, I try all the time to follow my conscience. You know, whatever I think is right, that's what I try to do.